our children gave me a very nice tape recorder, so now I have decided to tape my biography. It will not be meant to be knowledgeable, humorous, or instructive, but I will try to make it as factual as possible, giving facts as I remember them, and for some that I would prefer to forget. According to my birth certificate, I was born November the 30th, 1889. My mother's and father's names were Mary Ellen and Louis John, respectively. I was born on an 80-acre farm located on the south side of 12 Mile Road, 1/4 mile east of Southfield Road in Southfield Township, Oakland County, Michigan. 12 Mile Road and Southfield Road were gravel roads at that time. The house in which I was born was a frame structure, part 1-story and part 2-story, with basement and a wide front porch. The basement had a dirt floor, and access was by a stairway from the kitchen and also by way of an outside stairway. There was a cistern in the basement. The first floor had a living room, parlor, bedroom, and a large kitchen and a washroom. The second floor had 2 bedrooms. Heat was from a wood-burning stove in the living room and from a wood-burning stove in the kitchen. Light was from oil-burning lamps. The lamp in the living room was a pull-down type and had glass bangles all around. There was a hand pump in the washroom for pumping cistern water, but drinking water was always carried in by the pail full from an outside well with a chain pump. There was no inside toilet, but there was a 2-holer in the backyard. The kitchen range had a small tank for heating water and a small compartment for keeping food warm. Adjacent to the kitchen range was a wood box. The kitchen acted as the dining room. The washroom was where the men hung up their clothes and washed their hands preparatory to eating their meals. It also acted as the laundry room where the clothes were washed on a washboard in a wash tub before being hung up on the clothesline to dry. The living room was carpeted. A thin layer of straw was used under the carpet in the same way that rubber padding is now used under carpeting. We would often sit on the porch in the evening, and one of the first things that I remember was snuggling up to my mother as we sat there. Outbuildings consisted of a small horse barn, a grain and cattle barn, and 2-room frame building used as a chicken house and for the storing of firewood. There was also a small tile building without windows, which was used for smoking hams and bacon. My sister Anna, whom I later called Anne, was 2 years old when I was born. My sister Grace, whom I called Grace, was born 3 years after me, and my sister Verna was born when I was 15 years old. One of my first responsibilities was carrying in firewood for the kitchen range. I thought that this was a tremendous task. When I was very young, my father bought another 80 acres immediately to the east of the first 80 acres. I believe he paid $4,200 for this 80 acres. It had a small house and a small barn. The house was later used for living quarters for the hired man and his family. This farm was infested with mustard, an obnoxious weed which, if not destroyed, will kill out desirable crops. This weed was soon eradicated. When I was 5 years old, I started school in a one-room frame schoolhouse located about 1/8 of a mile west of Southfield Road on the north side of 12 Mile Road. There was a bell on the top of the building which was rung at the beginning of the school day, after the noon hour, and after morning and afternoon recess. The building was heated by a wood-burning stove and had kerosene lamps. There was an outside toilet for boys and one for girls. Every day, 2 children would be assigned to go to some neighbor's house and get a pail of drinking water. 1 tin cup was used in common by all the children and by the teacher. For recreation, we would play tag or shinny. Shinny is something like hockey, but is played with a plain stick and with a tin can for a puck. In the wintertime, we would skate on small frozen ponds in the adjacent woods. We carried a lunch in a tin pail, and it was quite common practice to swap an apple for a piece of cake or a piece of cookie for another kind of cookie. Rail fences were quite common when I was a small boy, and they would cause some large snowbanks. The ditches were sometimes filled with water, and we, on occasions, would break through the ice and get our feet and legs wet. Bobsleighs were quite common in the wintertime, and we would try to jump on one and ride on our way to or from school. My first, shall I say, scientific observation was the difference in the angle of the light rays coming in the school windows for the different seasons. I don't remember anything much out of the ordinary during my grade school years. I do remember quitting school one time, which my father said was okay, but I changed my mind and went back in a couple of days. As I grew older, I was assigned additional chores such as feeding the chickens, bringing in the eggs, and wood for the heating stove. I had some Belgian hares for a while. They are a large breed of rabbits. They multiply very fast, and we would butcher one occasionally to eat. I also had some pigeons. They were living in the barn and proved to be a nuisance, so my father gave me $25 to get rid of them. As finances would allow, my father built new buildings. The old barn was demolished, and a new 2-story frame barn was built. It had room for 6 horses and some storage space on the first floor and a hayloft on the second. Hay was pushed down through a chute to the manger below. There was a part of the manger for feeding the horses oats and corn. When I got a little older, I had the responsibility of feeding the horses, cleaning out the stables, and currying them. By currying, it is meant loosening of the salt of perspiration and dust with a special comb-like affair, after which the horse was brushed down with a stiff brush. I often marveled at the fact that the horses didn't mind this and never kicked. The next building to be built was a tool shed for storing farm equipment such as wagons, buggies, cutters, mowing machines, drills, binders, cultivators, and so forth. The next building was an addition to the barn. This addition accommodated 20 cows. Each 2 cows had a drinking cup between them and could drink water at any time. water level was kept constant by a float. The timbers for the barn addition were out of logs from the woods on the farm. A Mr. Brooks cut and framed all the timbers so that when finished, the neighbors came to what was called a barn raising. They raised the timbers and they all fitted together perfectly. I marveled at how this simple carpenter with a saw, a hammer, chisel, a hand auger, and a small ruler could so accurately prepare each of these many pieces that would make a complete barn frame. Later, a silo was built. Green corn stalks were chopped up by a machine and blown into the silo. This is called ensilage, and after a few weeks it ferments somewhat and smells sour. But the cattle like it, and it seems to be good for them. A hog pen was later built. Contrary to the common opinion, hogs are a clean, living animal if given the opportunity. The new hog pen provided a space for a straw bed, and the hogs slept there and kept it clean. Hogs were fed corn principally. They were sometimes fed beans cooked in a large iron kettle about 3 feet in diameter. A new chicken house was built, and then an ice house. Ice was harvested from what is now called Horton Lake in Birmingham and stored in the house. The ice was covered with sawdust and kept all summer to be used for cooling milk. The old horse barn site was a very fertile place, and watermelons were grown there literally by the hundreds. We would store them next to the ice, and when we wanted one, we would drop it on the ground, breaking it open, and then eat the heart only. They were delicious. Corn, oats, wheat, hay, and potatoes were the chief crops on the farm. The production of milk was the chief source of income. My father got a premium price for milk because it was produced under more sanitary conditions than was the case in those days on many farms. Milk was taken in 10-gallon cans to Woodward Avenue at 12 Mile Road and sent to Detroit by trolley car. Hogs were taken to the market, but occasionally one was killed for home use. Hams were smoked in the smokehouse, which I previously told you about, and in the winter time hung in an unheated bedroom on the second floor of the house. There was solid meat, something like a Tennessee ham that you can buy today, and they had a marvelous flavor. They were not flabby, as most hams are today. Until home refrigeration became popular, salt pork was quite extensively used, and good salt pork, if prepared properly, is very nice to eat. We, of course, had chickens whenever we cared for them. Eggs were also plentiful. Fresh beef was delivered about once a week by a meat man. At threshing time, the neighbors would come to help thresh the grain, and my mother would have a regular banquet for them. She had the reputation of being one of the best cooks in the neighborhood. We went to St. Mary's Church in Royal Oak. The church was a small frame structure at that time, and we had a German priest most of the time. We drove to church until later, when automobiles came into use. My father did not go to church with us very often because he was a Lutheran. My father bought the first automobile in the neighborhood, a Model T Ford. We had the first telephone in the neighborhood also. It was a wall type, and you would ring by turning a crank. Recreation was limited when I was small. There were a few boys in the neighborhood to play with. Skating in the winter time, swimming, fishing, and some baseball in the summer time were the chief pastimes. I did catch bullfrogs in the spring. They were in the ditch in front of our house. I would dress the legs, my mother would fry them. Frog legs are really good when freshly caught and fried. In the fall, gathering hickory nuts and walnuts was a lot of fun. I can well remember going into the kitchen on a winter's day with my mother and sisters and cracking hickory nuts. We would separate the nut meats and my mother would make hickory nut cream cake. Our Christmas presents were quite simple: an orange, some candy, and some other small presents. We enjoyed what we got and took care of any toys. The older persons in those days played cards, chiefly Pedro, had square dances, and just visited. I finished grade school in the spring of 1904 and started high school at the high school in Birmingham. Transportation was by horse and buggy, horse and cutter, by bicycle, or by walking. I carried my lunch, as did most outsiders. We ate lunch in the basement. One winter the cutter tipped over and the horse ran away and left us in the snowbank. The horse ran home and no particular damage was done. Math, physics, and chemistry were my favorite subjects. History and languages were not my cup of tea. Living in the country, as I did, with the additional chores that I had to do, and with my schoolwork, it seemed that I had little time for many social activities. By this time we had a pony called Topsy, and that I felt was mine, and I enjoyed riding horseback with her. She was a pretty black animal. One evening, I rode her down to what is called the tenant house, where the hired man and his family lived. When I started home, Topsy took off as fast as she could run. I could not control her. We had to make a sharp turn to go through a gateway. My saddle turned, and I almost struck my head on the fence post. It makes me shudder to think of it. During the vacation time from high school, I did some work in the fields, such as rolling, dragging, cultivating, raking hay, picking up potatoes, and so forth. The latter was hard on the back, to say the least. I graduated from high school in 1908. My topic at graduation time was the Hague Conference. I'm sure that I did not make an impression as a future public speaker of note, but I got through the presentation without my knees failing me entirely. My parents and I drove home in the horse and buggy, and they made no comments on my talk. I was sorry I did not do better, and I suppose they were too. That's the price parents sometimes pay in bringing up children. Since that time, I have viewed The Hague in Holland. Having finished high school, I began to make plans for the next chapter of my life. My desire was to study medicine, but I foolishly thought that I had to take Latin, which I did not think I could master. Engineering was my next choice, and that is the course I decided to take in college. I enrolled at the University of Michigan Mechanical Engineering Department. Well, I found that I had to take German and French for 2 subjects. I took German the first year and got an A the first semester and a B the second. The next year I took French. I got a C the first semester and F the second. The professor told me to study during the summer, which I did. I went back to take the test, and when I asked him if I had passed, he said, "Yes, but you shouldn't have." He was very right. That was the only F I got anyhow. I had a room with a family, and Vernon McDonald high school classmate of mine was my roommate for that first year and a half. We ate at a boarding house, and I thought the food was very good. It no doubt was, but now the same food would not taste so good. I did some exercise in the gymnasium and brought my physical fitness up considerably. I was boxing with Charlie Busey one day, and we agreed not to hit hard. It was not long before he was backing me up. I decided to hold up my ground, and fortunately, or unfortunately, the latter, I guess, I landed one on his nose and broke it. I was sorry about it, but it was really his fault. A classmate of mine was canoeing with me on the Huron River one Saturday afternoon. While going through the rapids, our canoe tipped over and we both went in the water. I was not a good swimmer, but good enough to hold onto the canoe and was able to make it to shore. Machine shop was one of the courses I took. While working on a lathe, the sleeve of the blue denim jacket caught on the chuck and began to wind up my jacket. I was strong enough to hold back while the arm of the jacket was torn off. I was not injured, but mighty scared. I took a course which comprised the testing of gasoline engines. One engine had 2 flywheels, each about 4 feet in diameter, and were not protected by guards. One time I slipped on the greasy floor and fell toward one of the wheels while the engine was running. Somehow I happened to get my hand on a spoke, not on the rim of the flywheel. That really frightened me. Dances were held weekly at the church hall, and I attended several of those. I did not indulge in any of the smokers or beer parties as many of the boys did. I did, of course, attend many of the football games. I never joined a fraternity. I worked in the library to earn a few dollars. One time, my roommate and I ran out of money. He had some odd pieces of aluminum left over from the previous summer when he was selling aluminum ware. We took the odd pieces and sold them from door to door. I tried to be as economical as I could be. I kept track of every dollar that my father gave me. It came to a little more than $800 for my 4 years in college. There were some subjects that I was obliged to take, and which, in my case at least, were a waste of time. Calculus was one of them in particular. I never could see how it could be put to any particular use. During the summer vacation, I helped on the farm. By that time, I was able to do mostly any farm work. I milked as many as 20 cows alone. One day, I took a load of hay to Detroit. On the way home, as I was driving alone, where the fairgrounds are now located, a man jumped on the wagon and said, "What are you getting for hay, son?" I said, "I don't know. It is sold on contract." He jumped off from the wagon then. I'm sure he was about to rob me if he thought I had any money. Woodward Avenue was gravel then, and there were toll gates on the way. In my senior year, the old frame house of the farm was moved and a new brick house built. It cost about $4,500. I built the septic tank myself. It functioned for 25 years when a connection was then made to a street sewer. Streetcars were still running while I was in college, and I went back and forth to Ann Arbor by that means. I would walk home from Woodward Avenue. Farms were all the way along 12 Mile Road as well as on Southfield Road. I graduated in 1912 with a degree of Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. Francis Jameson, a classmate of mine, and I took a job with Ingersoll Rand at their Painted Post New York plant. Ed Trexler from Lehigh and Pete Hopkins of Lehigh started with them at the same time. Except for a trip to Niagara Falls, my trip to New York was my first one outside of Michigan. We were given different jobs in the factory and in the office until it was decided that in what position they would best use us. I spent a good deal of time testing air compressors and some time in the office. Mr. Treiber, their chief engineer, was a wonderful man to work with. Painted Post was a small town in the Geneseo Valley with mountains with an easy walking distance. Corning was an adjacent town of about 10,000 persons and the home of the Corning Glass Works. Our pay was small. I believe they started us at $150 per month. I managed to save a small amount each payday, but it was not easy. I was asked to make a test on an air compressor for a Corning Glass Company. I did so one Saturday afternoon and charged them $10. That seemed like big pay. Being young college men, we were invited to many nice parties. I bought a full-dress suit with tails. Derby hats were in style then, and I had one of them. Shortly after I arrived in Painted Post, the company bought a large old house on a good-sized plot of ground and remodeled it into dormitories, complete with dining room, music room, pool and billiard room, and two double clay tennis courts. Living there was really luxury. We played tennis evenings and over the weekend, and I really enjoyed it. On Sunday, one Sunday, a man and his wife invited one of the boys and me to go for a ride with him. We were passing another car on a narrow road on the side of the hill. Our driver got too close to the edge, and we dropped down a 20-foot bank and over a fence. I jumped out of the car and landed on the ground ahead of the car and had managed to get out of its way. I was very fortunate not to be hurt or killed. After being in Painted Post for about 1.5 years, I was asked to go to New York City in their sales department. Their offices were at 11 Broadway, and I commuted to my room in Brooklyn by subway. The first trips were rather scary to drop down under the Hudson River. I had a room with a private family and took my meals in a boarding house as when I was in Ann Arbor. I still enjoyed my meals. Each weekend I would try to do something different, such as going to Coney Island, the Metropolitan Opera House, the Brooklyn Navy Yards, through Chinatown, a trip up the Hudson, and so forth. Flatbush Avenue was a short distance from my room, and they had some tennis courts there, which I used a lot. I played with another roomer in the same house. I beat him most of the time. He had a girl cousin from Ohio State visit him one weekend, and he arranged to have her play with me. Well, she took me the first 4 games, and it was 40-love in the 5th. I won the next serve, that game, and the next 4 games to win the set. I will never forget that singular experience. I was given a 2 weeks vacation, and some came home. When I went back, plants to look over the items they make there. Well, at that time in 1914, trouble started in Europe, and their export trade came to a halt so that they reorganized their entire sales force. They brought in many of their outside men and discharged others, of which I was one. As a result, I packed up my bag again and came home. Mortimer E. Cooley, Dean of the Department of Engineering of the University of Michigan, had charge of an appraisal of the Detroit United Railway lines. I got a job helping with this work. I would leave early in the morning and had free transportation on the electric lines to the various shops, stations, and powerhouses. I took inventory of the equipment in them, as well as inventory of equipment along the line. At that time, electric lines ran to Lake Orion, Port Huron, and Ann Arbor. I carried my lunch, and when I got home, was too tired to do anything but go to bed. I don't remember what pay I got, but whatever I got, I saved practically all of it. I had $500 saved when my father said he had a chance to buy some stock in a Royal Oak building for $1,000. He offered it to me. He said he would loan me $500. Well, I bought it, and about 1 year later sold it for $2,000. I invested this in a little house on Oakland Avenue in Detroit, and within a couple of years sold it for a profit of how much I have forgotten. Work in the railway appraisal lasted about 6 months, and I then took a job with Smith Instrument and Grills in Detroit, a firm of engineers and architects. My father died in 1917 while I was working with Smith Instrument and Grills. My work was to help on the layout of the mechanical equipment of buildings. There was some field work and, of course, some drafting involved. It was about this time that my father sold 120 of his acres of his farm for what was to become Bonnie Acres subdivision. One afternoon, while I was looking over a building in Windsor for which we were making plans for some alterations, which I have forgotten. Work in the railway appraisal lasted about 6 months, and I then took a job with Smith Instrument and Grills in Detroit, a firm of engineers and architects. My father died in 1917 while I was working with Smith Instrument and Grills. My work was to help on the layout of the mechanical equipment of buildings. There was some field work and, of course, some drafting involved. It was about this time that my father sold 120 of his acres of his farm for what was to become Bonnie Acres subdivision. One afternoon, while I was looking over a building in Windsor for which we were making plans for some alterations, they asked me if I would be ready to take a 5 o'clock boat to Buffalo. I said I could. They sent Hiram Walker, Leslie Smith, Pete Nice, and myself to Buffalo to design the mechanical equipment for a new factory for Curtis Airplane Company. We stayed at the Greystone Hotel and were picked up in the morning and brought back in the evening by automobile. Curtis sold the Ford that we had called for us each day, and I bought one for $100. I fixed it up a bit over the weekend and sold it for $200. When we finished the design work and the factory was completed, Curtis made me an offer to be their plant engineer, which I accepted. I took a correspondence course with Alexander Hamilton. I was not too faithful in the correspondence end, but did read all of the books on the various subjects and have enjoyed them very much. When it appeared that World War I was about to end, I made application for a job with the King Appraisal Company. A few days after the war was over, I got a phone call from them one afternoon asking if I could report for work in Baltimore the next morning. Well, I was able to do so, and so advised them. I started making inventory of mechanical equipment of the United States Industrial Alcohol Plant. This took only a few weeks, and then they sent me to New Orleans to another United States Industrial Alcohol Plant. I was there for a few weeks and then went to Chicago, where we priced the various items. When this was finished in 1919, they asked me to go to South America on another job, but my mother was seriously ill, and I came home to be with her. She died shortly thereafter. I took a job in the engineering department with Hudson Motor Car Company. That was the only job I did not like. The man to whom I reported was a phony. I decided to leave. Uncle John and I bought a Model T Ford, stocked it with some camping equipment, and drove to Seattle, then down to the coast to Los Angeles, where we sold our car and came home by train. This was a fair adventure in those days. Following the Yellowstone Trail, which was a dirt trail delineated by stones 10 inches in diameter and painted yellow. The campgrounds were simple in those days, but mostly all in a pretty location. We saw wolves, prairie dogs, ground squirrel, and jackrabbit. We cooked a jackrabbit one evening, and it was so tough we could not eat it. A nearby woman camper said, "Oh, I'd just as soon eat a cat as a jackrabbit." Uncle John replied, "I never ate a cat." High-pressure tires were used when we made this trip, and we used up one set by the time we got to Seattle and had driven perhaps 4,000 miles. One evening in camp, I removed the cylinder head from the engine and scraped out the carbon. Can you imagine doing that with one of today's engines? In a Model T Ford, the gas tank was under the front seat, and the gas fed to the carburetor by gravity. As we approached the Continental Divide in Idaho, the grade was so steep that the gas would not flow to the carburetor. I bored a little hole through an apple, screwed the apple in the gas tank bung, blew air into the tank, forming a pressure, and then stuck a cork in the hole of the apple with my tongue. This forced the gas to the carburetor, and with Uncle John pushing, we got over the divide. After going downhill past the divide for some miles, the engine began to sputter. Gas had been used, and a vacuum was forming on the tank. I removed the apple, and we were on our way. I was intrigued with Seattle, the climate, the fresh air, the fresh water in Lake Washington, shrouded by mountains and forests, were all beautiful to me. We sold our car in Los Angeles at a loss of $100. New car prices had dropped since we bought ours. Uncle John was a marvelous companion, and I enjoyed this trip immensely. I believe it was in 1921 when we came back, and I took a job with the Lansing Power and Light Properties, making an appraisal of same. I roomed and boarded with a Mrs. Hamill on Central Avenue. Tom Higgins roomed there too, and arranged a blind date for me with a Catherine Pease. We went to a very nice dance at the Women's City Club, and I met the elite of Lansing. Several of her boyfriends had signed up for about the first 6 dances. They thought that was quite a joke on both of us, I guess. Well, I thought my date was pretty nice. This job at Lansing took only a few months, and after which I took a job with the S.S. Kresge Company as their engineer in charge of designing, heating, lighting, and plumbing layout for their new stores throughout the United States. I had about 15 draftsmen. Their offices at that time were on the corner of Park and Adams Street in Detroit. After I was there a short while, I thought of buying the 30 acres back of our 40 acres on 12 Mile Road. The owner lived in Owasso. I drove my Model T Ford over there one day and made a deal to buy the 80 acres for $20,000. Gasoline was rationed at that time, and I had to use part kerosene to get back. I borrowed some of the money required for the down payment from my sister Ann. There was about 10 acres of woods on the 80 acres, and also an old barn. I sold the saw logs and arranged with Fred Kambler to live in the house and cut up the limbs for stove wood. He gave me $1 a cord. I made several trips to Lansing over the dirty, dusty gravel roads in my Model T Ford to see Miss Pease. And on October 16, 1923, we were married by Father John O'Rafferty in St. Mary's Church in Lansing. By that time, I had sold my Ford, and we took our honeymoon through the New England states in a 4-cylinder Essex. We rented an upper flat on Daly Avenue in Detroit, just south of Grand River Avenue. Catherine came down to meet me a couple of times at 5 o'clock, and we went over to the Teller to dance and have dinner. She bought a pair of blue denim pants and went hunting with me on the 80 acres, but this was not her type of sport. One noon I came back to the office a little late. My boss called me in his office and asked me how things were coming. I said, okay. He said he was recommending a raise for me of $100 per month. It was but a few months later that he gave me another $100 a month raise. My work involved some travel to the various cities where stores were being built. One time I arranged to go to Indianapolis and took Catherine along, from where we went to the Kentucky Derby in Lexington, Kentucky. Mary Ellen was born in 1924 in St. Lawrence Hospital in Lansing. Reynold was born in 1926 in Providence Hospital in Detroit. I think it was in 1926 that we sold the 80 acres that I bought 5 years previous for $80,000. We built a new house on LaSalle Boulevard in Detroit that year, and in four months after Reynolds was born. David was born in 1928 in St. Joseph's Mercy Hospital in Detroit. I believe it was in 1929 that I left Cressie Company and opened a real estate office in Birmingham with Lawrence Stow. I bought some acreage in Oak Park, Highland, Rochester, and Grand Blanc, all on contract. Uncle Fred and I bought 30 acres on the west side of Evergreen Road between 12 and 13 Mile Road. The Depression came and I forfeited my down payment on the Highland, Rochester, and Grand Blanc property. The Oak Park acreage had tripled in value before the Depression, but during the Depression, the value dropped to below what I paid for it. In 1931, we rented our house on LaSalle and moved to the farm on 12 Mile Road. It was impossible to sell any real estate, and I closed my office in Birmingham. Engineers and doctors were a dime a dozen. I took a job estimating for E.R. Spitzley, a large heating and plumbing contractor. I was supposed to get a percentage of any job we got. Spitzley went bankrupt, owing me something like $200, and we settled for one half of that amount. I took a job with E.R. Little Company, Engineering Designers, in Detroit. I was assigned to designing the heating system for the new Spring Wells pumping station for the Detroit City Water Department. This job was finished in the spring of 1932. It was about that time that we sold our home on LaSalle to Judge George Edwards. Uncle Fred Haack suggested that I run for Southfield Township Supervisor. This suggestion sounded silly to me at first, but I finally had some cards printed, made several house calls, and got my name on the ballot. I really surprised myself by beating George Bingham, an old-timer who had been supervisor of Southfield. The Depression was still on. Many persons were out of work and were on welfare. Money was hard to get. Script was used by some schools. My pay was $150 per month. Can you imagine that? Run a car, feed a family on that? Well, at that time, our groceries were only about $10 a week. I bought a cow, which gave us plenty of good, rich milk, and we had a garden. Ford Motor Company plowed some vacant land free for the township, and we planted gardens which were worked by persons on welfare. We had a building where persons on welfare came to get government food supplies. One of my duties as a supervisor was to assess all real estate and personal property in the township. I got a book on appraising and studied it. I prepared land value maps and set up some unit prices for various types of buildings, and in my opinion started one of the first assessment rolls in the county of Oakland on anything that approached a scientific basis. The State Tax Commission gave me a compliment. As township supervisor, I was automatically a county supervisor. The second year on the board of supervisors, I was appointed as member of the Equalization Committee, which reviews assessments in every township and city in the county. Fanny Adams was Southfield Township Clerk, and Charles Price had charge of welfare. Both of these proved to be very loyal persons. During the year as supervisor of Southfield, I took some courses in property management and real estate appraising from the Detroit Institute of Technology. Don Egbert, Birmingham City Assessor, was also a county supervisor. In 1937, he was made city manager and asked me to take his place as assessor. The job at that time paid only $250 per month, but it did not require running for office every year, and I accepted it. That was in 1937. Fern Thatcher had been Don's secretary, and she stayed in the office with me and was a great help in getting me acquainted with the office setup. About that time, Uncle Fred got the idea of selling topsoil from the 30 acres. We sold a few thousand yards of this dirt. We later subdivided the 30 acres and sold only one lot. Money was still scarce, and little investing was being done. We finally sold the balance of the subdivision to an investor. During the Depression, a large percentage of vacant property and some improved property was sold by the state for delinquent taxes. I bought perhaps 30 or 35 lots from the state. They proved to be good investments. Perhaps the one that showed the greatest percentage of profit was a lot near Northland Towers. I bought it for $25 and sold it for $6,000 some years later. Michigan City Assessors in 1940 founded the Michigan Municipal Assessors Association. I gave talks before the group for many different years. I was president of the association at one time, and finally in 1956, when I started as assessor of the city of Birmingham, I was made honorable life member of the association. Appraisers were required by the Veterans Administration, as they still are, for loans to veterans purchasing property. I made an application for appraisal to make appraisals for the Veterans Administration and was accepted. I made several hundred appraisals for them. I joined the Society of Residential Appraisers as an associate. I later took an examination and obtained the designation of Senior Residential Appraiser. Later, I was president of the Oakland County chapter. As business gradually picked up after the Depression and land values increased, it became necessary to increase assessments nearly every year. This meant considerable work, and of course, the property owner did not like to have his assessment raised. My sister Ann died in 1950 at the age of 63. In 1951, we purchased what we called the terraces on the southwest corner of Brownell and East Maple from Ruth Shane. Maintenance had been neglected. I had the yard cleaned up, some painting done, oil burners installed instead of coal. I bought a bargain loader, which Uncle Fred operated, and I sold topsoil from the 40 acres on 12 Mile Road. In 1952, the 40 acres were sold, with the exception of the residence. In 1953, I thought it would be nice to own the store on East Maple immediately to the west of the terraces. I wrote to Don Bell, the owner, who was living in Benson, Arizona, and asked him if he would be interested in selling. He said he would be in town within a couple of weeks and would see me. I bought the property. I began to think of retiring as a city assessor. I sort of had in mind staying with the city for 20 years. We were on the city pension plan, but in 1956, the city decided to change to the Social Security plan, which would wipe out the city pension plan. I had earned several quarters under Social Security through my appraisal work, and advised the city that I wished to retire before I came under the new city plan. My resignation was accepted, and I continued to start as assessor on a per diem basis until they found a new assessor. Now, as a result, I get a city pension plan plus Social Security. I had been with the city for 19 years. Since retiring from the city, I have continued to make appraisals on a fee basis. I joined the Real Estate Appraisers Association and was later made president of that association. In 1962, we sold the home at 17251 12 Mile Road and purchased a new home at 31787 Mayfair Lane in Beverly Hills. I believe I have been happier for having continued my appraisal work. I have had plenty of time to play besides. My chief sports are golf and tennis. Tennis is now too strenuous for me, but I do still play golf. I also like traveling, and we have done an appreciable amount of it. I have enjoyed every trip we have ever taken. We have gone through Canada to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, through every state in the continental United States, and to Hawaii, twice to Mexico, to the Caribbean, to the Canadian Rockies, twice to Europe, and I went with Dewey Hawthorne to Alaska by way of the Alcan Highway, and later around the world by way of Asia, Japan, and Alaska. As I get older, I find that it takes me more time to do less and less. And I now take only a few appraisals. I'd rather play golf. Life can be very complicated, but in my opinion, the simple things in life are the most important. It is dangerous to give advice. It is seldom, if ever, appreciated. It is something like the blind leading the blind. I suppose I should be one of the last persons to think of giving advice. However, if I were to make a few suggestions, these would top the list. Be honest in everything you do. Speak disparagingly about nobody. Be kind to everybody, especially the poor, aged, suffering, the happy, the needy, and the oppressed. They say that life is what you make it. This is not entirely so. You must have the love and respect of others, especially your wife and family. I have been blessed with a wonderful wife and children, all of whom I love very much, and to whom this biography is dedicated.